Good afternoon, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us today. It is the end of our NOAA Institutional Repository Week. We hope you enjoyed all of our informational emails that went out this week, and we're glad you're joining us to learn about DOIs. If you are joining us, you are an attendee, and as an attendee, you are muted for the presentation, but we encourage you to place questions or chat into the question or chat panel. If you have any logistical issues with your audio or visual components, try logging off and logging back to GoToWebinar. That fixes most issues. And with that, I would like to introduce you to Jennifer Fagan-Fry, our NOAA Institutional Repository Manager, and Jeff Ray, our Systems Librarian at the NOAA Central Library, as they bring to you another Publishing at NOAA series, seminar series. And this presentation, I'm all over my words today. This presentation is I Feel the Need for Publication DOIs, and I'm going to let Jen take it away.
Thank you, Katie. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As Katie mentioned, it's your old friend, Jen, the IR manager. I have Jeff Ray with us. He, as Katie mentioned, our systems librarian, but Jeff also is in charge of all of the DOI processes that go on in the NOAA Central Library. So Jeff is here to help answer any questions, make sure I don't misspeak. So with that, I'm going to get started with our presentation. Quick agenda. Today we're going to cover what is a DOI, what a DOI is not, policies and procedures that sort of dictate DOIs, like what publications get a DOI, how to get a DOI for your publication. We do have some changes in our NCL DOI policy, so we'll go over those, and how to use a DOI appropriately. So first, we'll start out with what is a DOI? We get this question a lot, and we love answering it because sometimes we forget not everyone is familiar with them as we are. A DOI is a digital object identifier. It is a persistent identifier used to identify objects. So a lot of times, a lot of people are familiar with personal identifiers like an ORCID. A DOI sort of works in a similar fashion. Except for an object as opposed to a person. So DOIs are actionable, they're interoperable, and they're persistent. And I'm going to keep coming back to that word persistent over and over again. So I have just a real brief definition here that they're used to identify academic, professional, government information. They can be used for data sets in addition to publications. Today, we're going to focus just on the publications. Next month, we'll have a second part in this series that's going to focus on DOIs for data sets. So I'll cover that a little bit later on. And I want to highlight resolvable. DOIs are resolvable, which means they are tied to metadata for that object as well as a specific URL. So it points to where the item is found. So what I'd like to do here is sort of talk about the DOI structure. So you have your DOI, which is this top box, the green one. That is the DOI itself. It always starts with the 10 dot whatever, and then has the unique identifier at the very end. And then sometimes we will talk about DOI URLs. A DOI URL is the actual URL and linked URL that leads you to that particular object. And you can see the DOI as part of that URL. So what I wanted to do here is sort of break it down a little bit further. The first part of a DOI, so this is a DOI that the NOAA Central Library has assigned. The first part of it, the 10.25923, is what's called a prefix. Sometimes we will call that a shoulder. So if you ever hear anyone in the library refer to a shoulder, sometimes we'll use that term for it, but it is a prefix. And that indicates the registrant. So in this case, that indicates the NOAA Central Library. So NOAA assigns identifiers to data sets and publications, and those are differentiated by the prefix. So the NOAA data sets have a different prefix. So just when you see this 10.25923, know that that's a publication. That is a NOAA publication, NOAA specific. The prefix for data does differ. And then the second part is the suffix, and that indicates the specific object associated with this number, with this DOI. So that it's an alphanumeric number, and that refers to one specific item and one item only. So what a DOI is not. Sometimes we get a lot of questions and there's a little bit of confusion about how DOIs function, what they can and cannot be used for. So we wanted to cover today sort of what a DOI isn't and what are some of the things that a DOI cannot do. A DOI is not intended to be a placeholder. It's not intended to be something that's there in the interim and then sort of disappears. It is supposed to be it is a number that identifies an actual tangible item, whether that tangible thing is physical or digital. It identifies that tangible item, and it must be associated with a tangible item. DOIs are not transferable. A DOI cannot be changed. It cannot be reassigned to a different version of a document, and we'll cover that a little bit more later on. But you can't sort of move a DOI from one version of your publication to the other, which is why we ask that you wait to ask for a DOI until you have the final version of the publication. And a DOI is not a URL. So a DOI sort of differs from a PURL, which is a permanent unique resource link. It's DOIs require maintenance. So a DOI points to a place. The DOI number will remain consistent, but a URL can change over time. And what the DOI does is it remains sort of a permanent way to follow that document. So the key thing I want to get across here is DOIs require maintenance, and that's what we do in the library, is we provide that maintenance service. So that you don't have to worry about someone not being able to long-term find your document. So where do all these DOI policies, procedures come from? There's two main places. The first is the NOAA Data Citation Procedural Directive. This is the policy for NOAA for all DOI assignments. This goes for data. It also goes for publications. Currently, what I have linked here is the current version, which is version 1. We do have version 2 that will be available later this year. We have been working on revising that and updating some of that information, especially in regards to publications, but there's also been some changes in relation to data and requirements and how things are assigned. So that should be out and available at some point this year. Within this document that I have linked here, it sort of details the criteria, what is required for obtaining a DOI, what is required in order to obtain a DOI, excuse me, and that goes for data and for publications. In the new version, in version 2, it will have information about reserving DOIs for publications and for data. And there will be some clarified language in regards to some of these processes too. So keep an eye out for version 2, but the basis of the policy, which is still available in version 1, still holds true. The secondary place, especially for publication DOIs, is within the NOAA IR document policy. I have that linked here. This is something we update regularly and frequently, at least 2 or 3 times a year. The portion of the IR document policy that refers to DOIs is publication specific, so there's nothing about dataset DOIs in there. What it does is it lists all the criteria for eligible publications and how to reserve DOIs in our policies that go along with reserving DOIs. So to get into that a little bit, what publications get a DOI? We are only able to assign DOIs to NOAA publications. So if you are looking for a DOI for your journal article, the publisher that you are submitting to will assign that DOI. We cannot assign DOIs to that. Additionally, we cannot assign a DOI to a publication that already has a DOI through another means. So if you are working on a joint publication with another agency, say EPA as an example, If EPA has assigned a DOI, that's it. That's the DOI. We cannot assign a secondary NOAA DOI to it. We use the EPA DOI. So the NOAA publications that are eligible for a DOI, most notably are our series publications, technical memorandum, technical reports, reference documents, cruise plans, cruise reports, any administrative reports, any of those sort of formalized series that we have. We also can assign DOIs to non-series items, such as reports to Congress. So we have a whole collection of Weather Act reports. All of those have DOIs. We assign DOIs to biological opinions that come from the NIMS Office of Protected Resources. We have assigned DOIs to policy documents. Every year we assign a DOI to the Chief Scientist report. We assign DOIs to the vision area documents. All of those are eligible for DOIs. Anything that's not listed here, we might be able to. It's possible we just haven't seen that type of document yet. So we do ask, if you'd like a DOI and it doesn't fit neatly into one of these categories, shoot us an email. Email the repository account. We are happy to take a look at it and evaluate it and let you know if we can do a DOI for it. There are very few things that we do not assign DOIs for. We don't do it for presentations. We don't do it for posters, things like that. But if it is a publication, send it to us. We're happy to take a look and make a determination and talk with you about it. So how do you get a DOI? So we have a couple different ways. I will say that DOIs are automatically assigned to all tech memos that are sent into the repository, whether you request a DOI for it ahead of time or not. So if you send us a DOI, or excuse me, if you send us a tech memo and you do not indicate that you have already requested a DOI ahead of time, or that you are not looking to have one assigned, it doesn't matter. We're going to assign a DOI. Tech memos are automatically assigned DOIs. So there's no need for you to request it ahead of time or anything. Just know that if it's a tech memo, it'll get a DOI. We do assign all those other DOIs to, all those other publications DOIs upon request. So within the form, speaking with submitting something to the IR submission form, there is an option where it says, what is your DOI? If you do not have one and would like one, please list, please assign. That's what I mean there. Just say, please assign, and we will assign that. If you are submitting via email, mention that you would like to have a DOI assigned in your email submission, and we'll take care of it. We do have a DOI request form. This is linked in multiple places. A, from the submission sheet, B, from our FAQs. We also have it on the IR homepage. It is under our quick links. There's a link right there to the DOI request form. We ask that you only request DOIs for items when you plan to embed the DOI. So, and what I mean by embedding is you take that DOI and actually put it into the document. So some people will put it on the cover page. Some people have, suggested citation formats that they'd like to put the DOI in. That's what we mean by embed it, where you're actually taking that DOI and putting it into the document. If you do not plan to do that, that's fine. You can still get a DOI for your document, but you don't need to request it ahead of time. Just let us know and we'll assign it when you submit the document to us. We do not require DOIs to be embedded on documents. I know at one point a long time ago, that was the library's policy that if you have a DOI, you have to embed it. We do not have that policy any longer. That policy has been rescinded. So you do not have to embed anything, which means if you don't want to embed it, you can just request your DOI upon submission to the NOAA Institutional Repository. So I kind of want to go through this process. I have this nice little diagram here of how to request the publication DOI, just to emphasize this a little bit. You'd have to fill out our Google form. It's real short, it's like 2 questions. Within about 24 hours, we will create that draft, what's called a draft DOI, and email that back to you. Once you have, and let me back up for 1 second, a draft DOI, I have a note here. This draft DOI will not be functional. So That's not a functioning DOI. It doesn't work. It's just a draft so that you can embed it into the document. So that takes us to our next step where we embed the DOI into the document. And then you take that finalized document that's 508 compliant and submit it to the institutional repository. So once you submit it to the IR, that's what makes the DOI findable. So once we have the items submitted and we're going to make the DOI findable, what does that mean? Essentially, a DOI is like a wingman for your publication, right? You'll see a few Top Gun quotes here. DOIs serve as a wingman for your publication. What it does is it points to the document's landing page within the repository, always. It will always point to that document's landing page in the NOAA institutional repository. That is where that DOI will always point you to. Now, as I mentioned, if for whatever reason we need to change that URL, we take care of that. But the DOI link that you have will always point you to this page. Regardless of what the URL itself is, the DOI URL is always going to point you to this exact page. So this DOI that's embedded, as you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, the DOI is embedded here right under the series name. That DOI will always point you to this document and to this page.
And so I actually want to follow up with that. That kind of it makes sense then that any DOI request will be for. It completely makes sense that any DOI request has to be for a publication that is going to go into the IR, not for any. You cannot request a DOI for publications that will live outside of the IR that would be hosted on external sites or resources. And one of the primary reasons for this is that the IR is a digital archive and is a system for long-term preservation.
Thank you, Jeff. So to go along with that, if you do not submit your document to the IR, your DOI will not be functional. It will be a dead link. And in our world, when we're talking about DOIs, we often say a DOI is a promise to the user. And you're promising the user by providing a DOI that they're going to be able to find that document. But if you do not submit if you request a DOI and you embed that DOI URL into your document and then you put it on your website but don't give it to us, you've broken your promise to the user. That DOI isn't going to point to anything because it's not in the institutional repository and that DOI has not been made findable. So you do have to submit your document to the NOAA IR in order for your DOI to become functional or findable. Nobody likes dead links. It's frustrating for everyone. So we do want to talk a little bit about some of the policies that we've had about DOIs, and especially in terms of reserving DOIs. Initially, the NOAA Central Library would assign DOIs and send those back to people, and there was a lot of communication back and forth. We've tried to, over the years, streamline this process, and our solution has been to have this option where folks can reserve a DOI through our form, and we send it back to them. We, as the library, reserve the right to delete DOIs that have not been submitted to the IR. And initially, when we set up that policy, we did sort of put a time limit on that. It was flexible. It was as I call it, squishy sort of timeline, but we did say within 120 days, if we hadn't received the document, we were going to delete that DOI. That over time proved to not work out very well. Documents sometimes get stuck in approvals, sometimes things need to be changed. So we weren't, oftentimes we were sort of missing that 120 days, and we understood why. So I will say the 120-day limit on a reserved DOI no longer exists. We will not delete your DOI after 120 days. However, and there's a big however, we will still notify you. You will still get an email notice, but what we're asking is that you just give us an update. Let us know that the document's still in process. If you have a new timeline, we do want to check in on those. If for whatever reason we do not hear back from someone after a certain period of time, we may still, as I said, reserve the right to delete that DOI. If that happens, we can still assign another DOI to that publication once it is finalized. So it doesn't mean if you request a DOI and we do wind up having to delete it because we didn't receive the publication, it doesn't mean that that publication is now ineligible for a DOI. It just means we'll have to redo the DOI and assign a new DOI. Jeff, did you want to?
Oh yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
I realized I was getting a little breathy there. So I will point out that, you know, it was not only an issue of we realized it was not realistic to have this 120-day time limit, but unfortunately on our end, we have limitations in tracking publications that are in the submission process. And so this became kind of an issue for setting up this 120-day limit, because if we can't accurately track submissions, or if things are submitted or not submitted, then we can't have full faith in sending out, you know, taking actions on DOIs. And so thus we eliminated this this policy for those two reasons.
Thank you. So the last thing we have to talk about is using a DOI, how they're used, the best way to use them, some best practices. So typically a DOI is used for finding a particular article. You can use the DOI or the DOI URL to locate an article. Within the library, that's how we find most things. We utilize DOIs to locate things, either within a journal page, a database, via Google, whatever it may be. When you are using a DOI in a citation, best practices, and this comes from DataSite, who's the big name in DOI minting or assignments. DOI should be expressed as a hyperlink in all citations and preferably as a full URL, but at the minimum, your DOI number should be hyperlinked. And I've given an example here. This particular item is also included in the NOAA IR, and I've included that link at the very bottom if you'd like to take a look at the item. But this here shows that DOI link at the end of the citation and when it was accessed, February 3rd, 2021. So just as a quick reminder for everyone on how to use DOIs. And with that, I do want to plug our next seminar, which is part 2 of our DOI series. So this is part 1. Part 2 will be all about dataset DOIs and archiving. And our speaker next month will be Don Collins of NCEI. He's an oceanographer and archivist, and he is one of the main folks that handles the Send to NCEI S2N system for archiving data for NOAA. That presentation will be on March 9th at 2 p.m. So back to our normal day on Thursday at 2 p.m. And we will have a link up for that shortly. We didn't have it before I made these slides, but we will have that in the next week or so. So please keep your eyes open for that. And then with that, I'm gonna see if Katie has any questions or if anyone would like to ask anything.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen and Jeff. Very informative. Even I learned some things. But we do have a few questions, and if people have more questions, please type away into that question or chat panel. So our first question is, does NCEP Office Note have a DOI for each note? I think this is a good question about if you have a series, does each document in that series get its own DOI?
So you actually chatted me this, Katie. This is behind the curtain stuff. What I could do, the easiest way to find out is for me, although we discussed all these processes, what I could do is pull a report, and this is a good time to plug our abilities to pull reports for people if they're interested in seeing any of what we have in the IR for anybody's documents or any documents people are interested in seeing. I could pull a report of all the NCEP office notes and send those out. And if they need DOIs for any of those documents that do not have DOIs, we could chat about working on getting those DOIs assigned, if that sounds like a good answer.
I will add on to that, just
If
broader,
Jen,
more
yeah,
high level. DOIs are assigned to an individual document, not a series.
yes,
Each individual document within that series would have its own DOI. And as Jeff said, we can pull a report and show you which ones have a series, excuse me, which items in a series have a DOI and which do not. I am going to caveat that with something I should have put in the slides and I did not, in terms of criteria, and I apologize. We do not assign DOIs to publications produced before 2015. There's a number of reasons for that. I'll just briefly cover a couple of them. One is cost. We do have to pay per DOI, and if we were to assign DOIs to all of our older publications, the cost would be astronomical. B, just time. The amount of time it would take us in the library to do that would be pretty daunting. So those are just two of the reasons why we do not do that. However, if you are submitting a publication that was published in 2017 and want a DOI for it, we can do that. It was post 2015. So any document published or produced in 2015 or later is eligible for a DOI.
so
And
Jan,
yes, go, Jeff.
I was going to say Jan Thomas, the librarian, College Park, mentioned that all NCEP notes that are submitted now do have DOIs. If the individual who asked that question is still interested in a list, I can pull a report. But as Jen did noted, there are some qualifications for minting DOIs for individual documents within the IR. We could still follow up if needed.
Great, thanks. I have another question. If a office submits their documents to NIMS, however, they have not submitted documents from over a year ago, can the fishery councils directly submit those documents to the IR?
Can you repeat that one more time, Katie? Just so I
Yeah.
can make sure.
Yep, sorry, I'm trying to make it clear. So the questioner asks, we transmit our documents to NIMS, however, they have not submitted documents from over a year ago. Can the fishery councils directly submit the documents to the IR?
In most cases, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Overall, yes. We would take a look at them, obviously, if there's any questions that we have about it. Just when you do submit them, make sure that there's someone that we can contact with any questions about those documents. I know in the past we have run into a few things that have been submitted from the councils that were things we actually couldn't take. Sometimes there are some copyright issues with council publications and everything, and especially depending on funding. So yes, is the short answer. You can absolutely submit those to us directly. Just be aware that we may contact you with some additional questions and might need to have a discussion about some of those publications. When it comes to asking for DOIs for those publications, that's a much muddier area. And those we would have to probably review at time of submission and talk with you about. I can't I don't feel comfortable, and not to speak for you, Jeff, but I'm sure he doesn't feel comfortable giving a blanket yes or no on assigning DOIs to Fishery Council documents. We haven't
I mean,
really had that.
if you don't feel comfortable on it, I don't feel comfortable on it.
I think we'd
Yeah,
have to just review it. It's not a no by any means, but it's something we'd want to review and talk to the submitter about. So my suggestion in those instances, go ahead and send them to us, and then just be aware that you very well may hear from me or Jeff with some follow-up questions and a discussion about them.
well, we
Great.
could I guess we could give both our contact. I guess I would suggest
Yeah, I
emailing
will.
both of us
Yeah, I will
with
add.
questions.
I will add on I didn't think to put it on here, and I'm not sure why I didn't do that. I will add my email and Jeff's email onto these slides for everyone, and we'll make the slides available for people if they're interested.
Yes, I will send these slides after those contacts have been added to everyone who registered to attend today. We do also
Thank you,
have
Katie.
a couple more questions if you guys
Sure.
are
Yes,
good.
by all
Okay.
means.
Yes.
Next question is, can chapters with different authors in a larger NOAA document have individual DOIs?
No.
Yeah, this has come up before.
This has come up a couple times in a number of different ways too. No, we cannot assign DOIs to parts of a document. As I mentioned, a DOI has to point to a sort of singular space, a singular object. So one good example of this and how we've sort of handled this is the most recent version of the Arctic report card, which is in the institutional repository. The 2020 Arctic report card is an item that had different authors for each chapter, but it's sort of a larger document. And how we handled that is we actually broke it into smaller documents. So each chapter became its own separate document, all of which have been linked together through what we call a series statement, which is linkable in the repository. And then each of those chapters was assigned its own DOI. So essentially we took each chapter, broke it out into its own document. And then there is a general DOI, but that DOI, and you can't see my air quotes, my general DOI points to the executive summary and table of contents for the Arctic report card as a whole. So short answer, no. There are some ways we can accommodate that, but we would want to talk to you about it because we can't have a DOI for a document and then have a DOI that points to a part of a document. That's not how DOIs work. It has to be to its own single item, a singular item.
Great, thanks. Our next question, if you want to submit a NOAA publication from before 2015, or I hope I'm reading this right, if you want to submit a NOAA publication before 2015, where can you get one? I'm assuming where can you get a DOI? I hope
Yeah.
the actor can clarify that. But
I'm going to assume that's what they're asking as well. That unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know where you would be able to obtain a DOI for those. I know that there are, when it comes to data, there are some options, but I don't know about publications. Unfortunately, that's just sort of been our policy, is that 2015 and newer is all we'll assign DOIs for. That being said, if it is an item that is going into the IR, while it's not exactly a DOI, the URLs from the institutional repository serve as a form of permanent URL or a PURL. Those links do not change. And they all have their own unique identifier. I've talked about them a little bit before, but they have what we call PIDs, or I forget exactly what PID stands for, but they're sort of like a record identifier. Persistent, thank you, identifier.
Persistent identifier.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. They serve in a similar sort of fashion. So when you look at a URL, and let me actually go back to, you can see down here on my on my slide at the very end of the repository link, repository.library.noaa.gov/view/NOAA 28019. That URL points to this document in the IR. It always will. And that's it sort of functions in a similar way. So if it's a pre-2015 thing, there is an option for sort of a persistent type URL, not exactly like a DOI, but it works in a similar fashion. So that is always an option.
Jen, just for me, can you kind of clarify that difference between a PURL and a DOI?
Sure. So a PURL is a persistent URL. So you'll see them a lot when it comes to government documents and things of that nature. But what it's essentially saying is that is the permanent link. That is the link that will always be there. That is the link forever and always. But a PURL is not the same thing as a DOI. So the DOI itself is just an identifier. So when we assign a DOI, and I'm sure some people have noticed this, initially, when you use the DOI link, the DOI URL, it doesn't point to the IR landing page. It points to the server, the library's local server, because that's the temporary housing location until we get the item into the repository. And then what we do is we take that DOI link and we do what we call flipping. We flip that link to the IR link, which is the PURL link. So essentially your DOI is pointing to your PURL in the case of NOAA IR items. Does that make a little more sense, Katie?
It does.
Okay.
It helps clarify. Thank you.
Sure.
I don't see any other questions unless someone is furiously typing right now.
We'll give them a second. I know sometimes when we talk about people often will use DOIs and PURLs and permanent links sort of interchangeably, and they're not. I don't want to say there's gray area because there's not gray area. Oftentimes, when people are assigning DOIs, they do what we do, and we link that DOI to a permanent link. But that does not mean that the DOI itself is a permanent link. The DOI is just the identifier that is attached to the permanent link, if that sort of helps in a way. Now we're getting into some real nitty-gritty stuff, real technical talk.
Thanks. Well, we do not have questions, so
Okay.
I think we have hopefully answered everyone's questions. There were a number of requests for this presentation slide deck. So Jen, if you want to maybe add those contact information, I will send it to everyone.
Yes, I will add those in and we'll get those out to everyone today or early next week.
Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And as Jen said, we will have a part 2 that discusses DOIs as they relate to data sets coming up next month. Thank you so much for joining us and have a wonderful long weekend.